It's a little chilly out there, isn't it?
I'll wait for the door to close so we can officially start. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza. I direct our Environmental Change and Security program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And our program is celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. So thank you for joining us in our celebration and exploration of these topics and these issues for a couple decades. And I'm really appreciating that we have such a full crowd today, given the wonderful weather. We brought the two Washingtons together, and I feel that our colleagues from Seattle have brought the lovely weather with them. So thank you. It's unusual for July in Washington, D.C. So we're very pleased for our event and discussion today, which we've organized together with the Henry M. Jackson Foundation and the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And as I think of this event today, I think that it captures the spirit of two great men, Scoop Jackson and Woodrow Wilson, who both believed in education, analysis, policy, and practice, and in bringing those worlds together, be it around international affairs, the environment, human rights, and public service. And support for this work at the Woodrow Wilson Center has traditionally come from USAID, its Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and from its Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. And these are important topics for us here at the Wilson Center. Our president and CEO, Jane Harmon, who many of you know, describes the Wilson Center as an intellectual candy shop where you don't get fat on spin. So today, we are going to explore climate change's impacts on national security without the spin, and to learn more about how the Pacific Northwest provides a national model for action. The event is being webcast live, and when we come to our discussion at the end of the panel, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves. Our colleagues will come around with a microphone before you have your question. So introduce yourself and give your affiliation. So I'd like to hand the floor over to Laura Itzigton, the Executive Director of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, for some opening remarks. Laura?
Thank you, Roger Mark, and welcome also to all of you. So as Roger Mark said, I'm the Executive Director of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. We've actually just marked our 30th year of existence. We were created after the passing of the late Senator Henry M. Scoop Jackson from Washington State. He was known to many around our country and internationally as an international statesman, but he also had a tremendous legacy in the environmental world, and so this particular topic today really marries two of his real interests. And Craig Gannett, our Vice President, will talk a little bit about why we thought this particular subject today was so much in the wheelhouse of Senator Jackson's legislative achievements. We hosted a symposium with our partner, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, in Seattle in June of this year. Several of the people on the panel were there, and we brought together 36 leaders from federal agencies, from state and local government and research organizations and business and academia to discuss this nexus of climate change and national security, and to add to some of the discussions that are taking place at institutions such as the Wilson Center and the Center for Naval Analysis and elsewhere around this really important topic. And we produced this paper, which I think most of you have seen out front, and we urge you to take, which begins to pull together some of the conclusions and thoughts which emerged from that day. And we're proud of the initiation of this topic, and we're glad to be continuing it here in Washington, D.C. today. And I would also just like to say that we've had a wonderful working relationship with Pacific Northwest National Labs and with the Wilson Center. So thank you to both institutions. Now I would like to introduce Gretchen Hund, who is the director for the Center for Global Security at PNNL. Thank you very much.
Well, I too would like to echo a thank you and talk about how thrilled we are to be partnering with the Jackson Foundation on this important issue, and also having the opportunity to share with you, some of the findings from the research that we've been doing on kind of this broader linkages between climate change and national security. And for those of you who don't know, PNNL, which is easier to say than Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, is a U.S. Department of Energy laboratory, and we conduct research really looking at fundamental science, energy and environment, and national security. And within National Security Directorate, there is something called the Center for Global Security, which, as Laura mentioned, I'm the director of. And what's really fun about that is that we get a chance to look out, 5, 10, 15 years, kind of over the horizon, or what are going to be those big issues that are going to be important to us? And how do we look at that intersection of the gaps and kind of the cutting edge research that's going on, the policy development that's needed, as well as kind of technology innovations and implementation? So the challenges found at that intersection is kind of perfect back to the wheelhouse metaphor as far as what the center does. And last year we were fortunate to conduct an assessment looking at what really these big threats are going to be. And big surprise, what rose to the top was climate change and resiliency. So what a fabulous opportunity to have a chance to look at this deeper and to have the Jackson Foundation as a partner to do so. So I just want to say personally, thank you for coming, and I really look forward to the discussion and to learn not only from the panelists, but also from all of you. So the Q&A should be really interesting. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Craig, I should.
No problem. That was one of the better introductions I've had. Welcome, everyone. I'm Craig Ganna. I'm one of the vice presidents of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. As Laura said, the purpose of the foundation is to carry on the legacy of Scoop Jackson. Scoop's legacy was very broad, but I think fair to say, his three highest priorities were the environment, energy, and national security. He was the primary author of the National Environmental Policy Act. He served as chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where I had the honor of serving on his staff, and he served on the Senate Armed Services Committee. He would have immediately recognized the importance of the intersection between climate change and national security. Before we turn to our panelists, I want to spend just a couple of minutes on what national security means in the context of climate change, because it's central to our whole discussion this afternoon. National security traditionally meant protection against military action by state actors. In the last couple of decades, that definition has broadened to non-state actors, commonly known as terrorists. But even that definition is now too narrow. As the impacts of climate change become more pronounced, national security includes this vast array of disruptions caused by or exacerbated by rising sea levels, drought, hurricane, wildfires, and other other man-made disturbances resulting from climate change. And these national security implications arise not only overseas, but at home. Overseas, anytime the U.S. military has to respond to regional conflict that was the result of a drought, for example, or has to provide aid in the aftermath of a hurricane, that is drawing down on the resources that we otherwise use in the advancement of our national security. It stretches those resources tighter. The same will be true when eventually, if the modeling is accurate, millions will have to leave low-lying areas of the sea, around the sea, for upland areas that are already overpopulated. That is not to say that every hurricane is a national security issue, but it is to say that national security is implicated anytime you have an extreme weather event that constitutes a major stressor on vulnerable populations, unstable nation states, or sensitive natural systems. So that's the international side. At home, our economic prosperity is the foundation for our national security. And so when our agricultural production is depleted or reduced as a result of drought, we are a weaker nation as a result. If we cannot effectively move our goods through our ports and over our highways, we are a weaker nation. So national security is no longer about counting tanks, counting missiles, or counting terrorist cells. It's about coping with these unprecedented changes, some of which we can foresee and some of which are simply unimaginable. So what do we do about it? In the simplest possible terms, we have to mitigate and adapt. We have to mitigate by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and we have to adapt to the changes in the environment that are no longer avoidable. Neither mitigation nor adaptation can be accomplished by EPA acting alone, or DOD acting alone, or AID acting alone, or even local governments acting alone. And it most definitely cannot be fixed without the investment and innovation from the private sector. And all this, frighteningly enough, must happen as soon as possible before the unavoidable becomes the overwhelming. Fortunately, we have 4 individuals here today with deep insights into the path forward. 3 of the 4 participated in the symposium that Laura mentioned that we had in Seattle. Commander John Marburger was not there, but he briefed the Navy captain who briefed us on the important work that the Navy has done, and he is also at the climate change office within the Navy, and so he will be a great addition this afternoon. Briefly, our 4 speakers are Alice Hill, White House Senior Advisor for Preparedness and Resilience, who I'll introduce more fully in just a moment, Commander John Marburger, who I just mentioned, Dr. Ian Krachunas with PNNL, who will talk to us about trends and tools available to decision makers, and last but not least, Larry Phillips, who chairs the King County Council, which is the county surrounding and including Seattle, on what the Pacific Northwest is doing to tackle these challenges. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Alice Hill. Alice is a retired judge, which as a lawyer I respect right off the bat, who joined the White House National Security Council staff in September of last year as Senior Advisor for Preparedness and Resilience. In that role, she serves as the Principal Advisor on, believe it or not, preparedness and resilience arising from climate change. Her duties include advising regarding the implementation of the President's Climate Action Plan, which was a monumental step forward, the implications of which are being played out in many directions. In developing policy regarding building resilient infrastructure, part of our adaptation strategy, and in improving the ways in which climate change-related information is disseminated, something that Ian also will be addressing. But at a governmental level, that's a key issue to seeing how that information is put into the right hands. Prior to joining the National Security Council staff, Alice served as Senior Counsel to Secretary Napolitano of the Department of Homeland Security. With that, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really my honor and pleasure to be with you here today, and I have a chance to relive a wonderful symposium. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson for reprising the event here and for their continued leadership in addressing issues of the environment and climate change. And I want to thank the Jackson Foundation as well as the Pacific Northwest National Labs for their leadership in pulling together
really an unusual event, particularly on the regional or state level, to be looking at the issues of national security. They were innovators in recognizing that this is an issue that we all need to think more deeply about, and that we need to increase our analysis so we understand what the impacts of an accelerating rate of climate change will have for our national security. I think they very aptly named this event, What Do We Need to Know? And that is the first question. I want to thank Craig for his definition because I think it reflects the breadth of issues that become involved when you start thinking about national security and what it means when you include climate change. So what I want to do today is give you a brief background of some of the seminal thinking that has gone on in the federal government with regard to this issue of climate change and national security, and then also touch on what the president is doing through his climate action plan to address this serious challenge for the United States, but of course for the world. So the first is that in 2010, the National Security Strategy was issued, and you can see it says the danger from climate change is real, urgent, and severe. So that is really I guess, a stake in the ground that the federal government will be addressing this issue. And it talks about some of the anticipated consequences by a warming planet, including conflicts over refugees, resources, increased suffering from drought and famine, catastrophic natural disasters, and of course, the environmental impacts that will degrade the land across the world. In 2014, the Defense Department issued its quadrennial defense review. This is issued every 4 years. And previously, in their previous review, they also called out climate change as posing a challenge for the United States. So that document contains additional findings about what climate change could mean for the United States. Shortly after the DoD quadrennial review, there was the quadrennial Homeland Security review, which is issued by the Department of Homeland Security. And you'll see that in 2014, they're saying climate change and associated trends may indirectly act as threat multipliers. They act as an additional stress to poverty, to conflict, to environmental degradation, just an added factor that increases instability across the globe, and with increased instability, that affects our national security. The U.S. energy sector was examined by the Department of Energy in June 2013. This was an in-depth analysis. That department is now going on to do its own quadrennial energy review. That has not been published yet, but these are their findings that climate change could restrict the supply of secure, sustainable, and affordable energy critical to the nation's economic growth. And they talk a lot about the secondary and tertiary effects on power caused by extreme weather events, wildfires, droughts, decreasing the level of cooling, water available, and therefore power plants have to be shut down. The Government Accounting Office got into the fray here as well. They have listed this issue on their high-risk list. This is a list they create that they follow issues that pose high risk to the federal government, and they follow them until the issue is resolved. Climate change has been added to that because it poses risks to many environmental and economic systems and presents a significant financial risk to the federal government. And that is going to be both from recovering from disasters as well as our own facilities to the extent that they are damaged by extreme weather. There will be increased costs for the federal government. We also have issued a national Arctic strategy. That was in 2013. I think many in this room are aware. I've met with some of you in the past. The Arctic is ground central for climate change. The rate of change in the Arctic is far greater, nearly double, I understand, than the rate of change in the rest of the world. So that area is already suffering from impacts of increased heat in a very visible way. And that has caused concern about what the effects will be. And you can see in the left-hand corner, there is a model simulation of the decrease of the sea ice concentration, and that has already increased the level of shipping. Last year, 74 ships crossed the Arctic, and in 2004, I think there were something like 4. So already we're seeing increased shipping occurring, and we know that nations that aren't even Arctic nations are getting into the act. The Chinese sent some vessels through last year to take advantage of the decreased shipping cost and shipping time as a result of the decreased shipping costs as a result of using the Northern Sea Route. So we are paying a great deal of attention to the Arctic and trying to better understand the implications for resourcing the needs of the Arctic and how we will be sure to protect that area from environmental degradation. Now, those are the documents. I just walked you through the documents from the federal government. Of course, there have been international documents on this. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has also done in-depth analysis on the national security impacts of climate change globally. And you can see that they talk about a slowdown in economic growth. It's going to be more difficult to reduce poverty. Food security will be a challenge across the globe. And it will affect, of course, those who are most vulnerable and those who are already living in poverty, making it more difficult for them to climb out of poverty. In 2014, in April, the U.S. government issued a document that I would highly commend to you, the National Climate Assessment. If you're curious about effects in your region, you can study what is anticipated for where you live. But I think the item that document confirmed for the federal government is that the impacts of climate change are here now. We used to think when we were just talking about this issue 4 or 5 years ago, oh, that's sometime in the distant future. It's not. Although we cannot tie any particular event to climate change, we can tie the trends of extreme weather to climate change. And therefore, in a consensus document, a great number of climatologists gathered together and concluded that the impacts are here now. And this is just a map of the globe. I know you can't read it, but it's issued by NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It shows anomalies and events, significant climate events across the globe in 2013. So these are events that we haven't seen in the past, but are suggested to be tied to climate change. And that just shows you that the rate of impacts is accelerating, which means that we need to be accelerating our efforts to prepare and adapt. We also need to accelerate our efforts to mitigate the emissions that are causing these impacts. So I want to talk through a little bit about what you might see, and I thought this is one of the great things about the report that was issued as a result of the symposium in Seattle, is that these impacts are local, but they have national effect. And so I chose the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River carries about 60% of the grain that's shipped out of the Gulf, and it carries it down through barges. It's really one of the most important arteries for us to ship our grain from the Midwest and ship it out internationally. In 2011 and 2012, first the Mississippi, it's hard to see, was shut by drought. So the barge traffic couldn't go through. And when the barge traffic goes down, the alternative means of transportation are quite expensive. So that will have an effect on food prices. But then what happened is it shut due to flooding. And that's emblematic of the kinds of extremes we're going to have. We don't have enough water, and then we have too much water, which has economic impacts on our ability to secure our supply chain, in this case of food or grain. The other impact that we are certainly focusing on initially are the impacts on infrastructure. This was also a subject of discussion at our meeting in Seattle. And in the top left-hand corner, you can see that that's a picture of a building tilting. That is a picture of a building that is tilted as a result of melting permafrost. And this is what we can anticipate in our northernmost regions in Alaska. All of that was built on permafrost that's been frozen for a very long time. If you travel to the Arctic, you can talk to some of the native fishermen who rely on subsistence fishing, and they dig I don't know, huge cellars to store their fish to make sure that they have sufficient food for the year. And because the permafrost is melting, that is no longer a sound way to store their food in some places. On the right-hand side are the wildfires. You'd have to not be reading the news to know that, not know that there are massive wildfires occurring across the West, and that's as a result of very dry conditions. It's also predicted impact for a changing climate. As you have increased temperatures, there's less water in the ground, in the plants, and the burning increases. But what that also does is a lot of transmission lines in the West go through areas that are vulnerable to wildfire. So you get the wildfire not only destroying the property, but also destroying the power sources in a time of great heat. This is an area where we really are still learning about the secondary and tertiary effects, a little bit like what the Department of Energy was doing in examining what the effects of energy are. But in this area, I met with an emergency manager from California this morning, and he was describing a challenge I had not really thought about. If you've ever watched wildfire in Southern California, where I lived for a very long time, you'll see helicopters come along with huge buckets, and they scoop down in the reservoirs or the ocean if it's nearby, and get the water, and then they fly over the fire, and they dump the water. It's a pretty simple method for fire prevention and control. But in inland, when they're really relying on those reservoirs, you start dipping and taking that water to fight the fire, you're not going to have sufficient drinking water. And those are the kinds of effects we need to think through. How are we going to fight these fires if we're in a drought condition and we need to have sufficient reservoirs? On the bottom left are railroads kinking from heat. We had here in Ronald Reagan, July 2012, I think the hottest month on record here locally. On the tarmac, a plane got stuck because the asphalt melted, and then you have flooding with bridges washed out. This is just a discussion of what we are learning is we have to understand how we all interact with one another. This is pre-Sandy. You'll see on downtown Manhattan, I think on Wall Street, a business trying to get ready for Sandy. So they put down some sandbags. Probably were not enough sandbags in hindsight for what Sandy looked like. So this is to show our interdependencies. So then you have one of our major financial institutions, and for those you can't see, they're really high sandbags. So they're going to be prepared. They're going to be able to be open and ready for business. And then the next you see is a building all lit up. So they did have power, which was a remarkable event, but they have cars floating in front. your employees can't get to work. So your building may have been incredibly well preserved, but if the transportation system's not working, if your employees are stranded elsewhere, you're not going to be operational. And one of the interesting things about what happened in Sandy is that in parts of lower Manhattan, which was particularly affected, they had the highest percentage of LEED certified buildings. But a good number of those buildings were flooded out and did not have the power like this because they had their electrical machinery in the basement, and it got flooded out, which meant there was no power. That's an illustration of how we need to start thinking differently as we prepare for extreme weather. If you're going to have water in your basement in a routine basis, you better not have most of your mechanical equipment in the basement. And that's the type of thing that we're trying to work with builders and others so that we get better at being prepared. This is a picture of Typhoon Haiyan over the Philippines, and it's a quote from Secretary Kerry noting that climate change can now be considered another weapon of mass destruction. And this particular typhoon illustrated the stress that will be placed on DoD in particular in performing humanitarian missions as we have countries other than the United States deeply affected by extreme events. So the last slide here is just a little bit about the President's Climate Action Plan. There are 3 pillars. The first pillar is mitigation of harmful greenhouse gases. Really, the more we mitigate, the less we will have to adapt. So we very much need to make sure that we are working on cutting carbon pollution. The next is preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change. So that's doing the types of things we've been talking about, making sure that your buildings are resilient and continue operations, that you build roads, bridges, infrastructure that can withstand what is predicted to be coming. And the final is that we lead international efforts to address climate change. So that is to make sure that as the globe addresses these issues, that the United States is helping all countries accomplish what needs to be accomplished to ensure that we are safe and secure and can survive the effects of climate change. So thank you very much. It's really my honor to be here with you today.
Thank you, Alice. We'll take questions at the end. I just want to give you the Washington State perspective. Alice mentioned wildfires destroying transmission lines, and as some of you may have heard, Washington State is just now recovering from the largest wildfire in its history. I think it's 40 square miles in north central Washington, which has destroyed the transmission and distribution lines of one of our utilities. That happens by day. I'm an energy lawyer. It's one of my clients, and it's never a good thing when your client is on NPR talking about the destruction to their infrastructure. But we in the Northwest have seen a very telling example of from which they are still recovering. So for our next speaker, Commander John Marburger, an Illinois native. John graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with a degree in physical oceanography and has a master's in physical oceanography and meteorology from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Commander Marburger has served a variety of roles for the last 16 years. One of the most interesting I found was that he was one of the typhoon duty officers at Pearl Harbor, where he was responsible for tracking the path and intensity of cyclones in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And based on that, he was able to answer my highly technical question, which is, what's the difference between a hurricane and a typhoon? And the answer is nothing. But so he comes to this role. He's now he's the climate change officer with the Task Force Climate Change of the Navy. And so he comes to these broad policy questions, having dealt with very much the here and now of climate change and how it affects national security. So, Commander Marburger, please.
Thanks, Craig, very much. And thank you on behalf of Admiral White for allowing the task force to come here and discuss the Navy's interest and the Navy's initiatives that we're dealing with climate change. On a more personal note, I'm very happy that I'm part of a panel that has such strong ties to the Pac Northwest. I really I have fond memories of my time on the USS Abraham Lincoln out of Everett, and it's on a very short list of places where we might settle once this Navy adventure is all over. So we might be neighbors someday. So
We would welcome that.
So, see if I can get this to work. It's the red button, I assume, right? There we go. Thank you. So from a 30,000 foot level, Task Force Climate Change in the Navy looks at climate change not as a temperature change issue, but more along the lines of what Alice Hill just said. It's about water. It's about too much water. It's about not enough water. It's sea levels rising, flooding, drought, and then how that affects people, and then furthermore, how that affects people's behavior. That behavior, unfortunately, is often adverse. And when that behavior is adverse, it leads to issues throughout the world that the Navy is often called upon to be the first responder to. So when you think, maybe put it in a new paradigm on your understanding of climate change and think about it not from a temperature standpoint, but start thinking about it from a water standpoint, and you'll really start to get how this nexus of food and water and energy really come together, because that's what's going to drive the discussion on national security. So the Navy really breaks it down. This is our trident of climate change issues. We break it down into three different issues. Of course, the Arctic kind of led. So the Arctic is largely a maritime environment, and the fact that the Arctic is being affected for climate, it's manifesting, climate change is manifesting there in a way that is much more dramatic than the mid-latitudes, kind of forced Navy in 2009 to stand up this task force, and the CNO at the time said, we need to start asking the hard questions of what do we need to do right now to prepare for the possibility of a seasonal, or maybe even all year round eventually, opening of a new ocean, because the Navy has not really operated up there since the Cold War. We need to build our experience base. There's lots of stuff that we need to do. A second of all, of course, is what the topic that we're talking about today is global security. Again, as mentioned, the Navy is going to be the vanguard of our national security policy to make sure, we're usually called on to respond either from an HADR standpoint, like humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or even worse, if we have to get into some sort of conflict that is exacerbated or stressed by climate change. And then third, of course, and I'll talk quite a bit about this, is infrastructure. So the nature of the Navy's business lends towards our bases being on the water. Sea level rise is one of the effects of climate change that we can very easily track, and we have a pretty decent handle on predicting. So that being said, the Navy has a very big interest in infrastructure and how we're going to plan and adapt to what we're doing. Okay, so real quickly on the Arctic. The Arctic, if you want to take anything away from the Arctic here today, is this is a chance for us to get it right the first time. This is our first opportunity. And when I say it, I mean the ability to prepare and to plan and then to collaborate in step with our partners in the Arctic. This is a chance really to show what we can do first on how the climate is changing. Our roadmap, I'm sure that some people are familiar with the Navy's Arctic roadmap. It was released in the beginning of this year. And it lays out a pretty good plan, a good foundation of what the questions are that the Navy is going to have to ask and what actions they're going to have to take in order to make sure that we're supporting the President's national strategy on the Arctic region, and we're very serious about that. Next is the global instability and conflict risk. So what you see up here, and you can't see it very well, unfortunately, in red, I apologize. All those areas that are circled are areas that are very susceptible to sea level rise. And as you can see, especially if you go into the 5th Fleet and the 7th Fleet, so the Northern Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific Ocean, there's an awful lot of places that fall in those red circles that already are pretty unstable to begin with. And when you start adding in the potential for sea level rise, drought, all the things that come from potential climate change effects, you really start to think, well, what are we going to do if we start to have these things occur more often? So there's really three things that the Navy is focusing in on. The first is making sure the fleet is prepared for potential increases in humanitarian assistance disaster relief missions. We've got that down pretty good. I mean, we've done HADR for quite a long time, but we need to make sure that the fleet is sourced in order to do that if it starts happening more often. The second is, and this is a really important point, is to figure out how that we can share the adaptation methods and methodologies that we're developing right now domestically with our partners and our allied navies that are overseas. I think that Task Force Climate Change is pretty much convinced that disaster prevention is going to be a lot less expensive than disaster relief. And then finally, and the Navy is just beginning to think about these sort of things right now, is, you know, we call them kind of our varsity level events. It's taking the HADR situation and advancing it even a little bit further. So what happens if you have an HADR event and then it becomes more of a conflict type event that needs the Navy to respond in a regional type of way, and we need to make sure that the fleet is ready for that, and of course the Navy is sourced for that. And then lastly, I talked about infrastructure, and most of the remaining slides are going to talk about this because this is where most of our efforts right now are focused. And this does tie into national security, because without our bases and the ability to get underway to do HADR and respond to conflicts, there's no way that we can end up doing that. The bases are very important for mission sustainment. I guess sea level rise, of course, is the biggest thing that we have to worry about. Our bases are right next to the water. I've already talked about that. And that leads me to the next slide, which is, what are we doing exactly? I want to point out that, and this is a really good thing about climate change adaptation efforts, and you can ask my Air Force colleague Dan Kowalczyk there in the audience, the Air Force is going to respond very similarly to the Army and to the Navy, and to maybe it would be Coca-Cola Company or McDonald's or a municipality in preparing for adapting to climate change. There's nothing special that the Navy is going to end up doing methodologically that will set it apart. And that's a good thing. So I want to point out that all these efforts that we're doing that I'm about ready to talk about are working in lockstep with the Department of Defense. And we take those partnerships within DoD and with Air Force and with Army very seriously. So the first step in adapting is you have to understand where you're vulnerable. So the Navy's doing this in two ways. There's a DoD initiative, there's a screening level vulnerability assessment that we're working on, which is essentially just a questionnaire that we've sent out to all of our infrastructure saying, hey, have you been impacted by climate change already? And we list out a whole long list of things that could be already affected, whether it's storm surge, drought, non-coastal flooding, and they respond back. And then we also say, well, what would happen if you had 3 feet of sea level rise on top of this? What percentage of your base would be affected? What about 6? What about 9? What about 12? And that gives us an idea of kind of where our vulnerabilities lie. And that's key to forming the foundation of how you're going to adapt. If I can go back real quick. The Navy also has done a more specific deep dive for the Norfolk region. And this is one output from that. And what that shows is, okay, you know that Norfolk has already kind of got issues associated with sea level rise, the Hampton Roads area. So this takes one individual mission for that base, which is you got to bring an aircraft carrier in. You have to be able to pull her in, pull her up next to the pier, and provide steam services. Well, what are the services and what are the infrastructure behind that steam pipe on the pier that connects to the ship that could be affected based on where it is on the base, how low lying it is, what building is it in? Is it in a building basement? Probably not a good idea. And these are the type of thought processes that the Navy is going through and making sure that we're understanding vulnerability from a micro level, not from the macro level. And then no matter how well you understand what your vulnerabilities are, there's no way to put a timeline on action unless you have some idea of what the local mean sea level rise is going to be. So the Navy is working closely with Department of Defense, again, to come up with local sea level rise scenarios based on emission scenarios to allow planners at these bases to decide how are we going to adapt, what are we going to do, where are we going to build, and those numbers are very critical. And from a risk standpoint, and as Hurricane Sandy taught us, nobody gets mean weather and nobody gets mean sea level, okay? You get extremes that are thrown on. We call those the tails of the distribution. So you got to take all of those different things and you add them on top. So that red line there is mean sea level, and then you add various different oscillations that are of higher frequency on top. So you have El Nino, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, you have maxed astronomical tides, and then on top of that, of course, you have nor'easters, you have hurricanes, storm surge, and all that goes on top of each other. And that's really how you figure out what episodic risk you're planning to. And so that's another thing that Navy is looking at in conjunction with DoD. And then these last two slides, I think, and Dan would certainly, I think, agree with me on this, is that there's nothing harder in this business of adaptation in figuring out how to convey uncertainty and not let it lead to inaction. So I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with this type of thing. So the first thing that we're doing in order to conquer that is not to make up some grandiose instruction on climate change within the Department of Defense. What we're trying to do is we're trying to insert language in all of our existing instructions that say you must consider climate change when you're doing X, Y, and Z. And this is a perfect example of this, is that if you're doing infrastructure projects, if you're doing maintenance actions or maybe temporary infrastructure, it's probably not very important to think about climate change. However, if you're doing base realignment or a building that's going to last for 75 years, a bridge that's going to last for 100 years, it's probably pretty important that from an engineering standpoint and from a risk planning standpoint, you sit down and you really start to take into account, hey, how much risk can we actually take for this project? Because climate change, the trajectory we're on, and the variance about the mean of that trajectory is going to lead to risks that maybe we haven't thought about using the traditional methods of looking back 100 years and seeing what the 100-year flood is and deciding that that's the way that we're going to build to, because that's probably a very risky way of doing things. And then finally is taking all that information, saying, hey, here's some data. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with it, but we need to act. And there's different ways of doing this. You can predict and then act, which is kind of the old way of doing things. You can predict, you can act in part, and then reassess. An example of that is let's say you're trying to, you might have to build a levee somewhere. But in order to do so, you need to procure land in order to do it. So what you do is you go ahead and in your overall planning documents, you say, well, we're going to procure this land, but we're not going to build on it because we don't necessarily know if we need to do it. We'll reassess in 5 years, 10 years, and then move on. And then finally, the third way is kind of the picture over there on the left, which is acknowledging that there's all sorts of different things that can happen with climate change. You take and you lay each one of them out. Let's say that sea level rises 0.5 meters. Let's say it rises 1, 2, something along those lines. And these are all the different mitigation or adaptation actions that we could end up taking in order to try to work around those. And you figure out the pros and cons of each, and then you try to figure out which would be the best one to go forward. There's lots of different methodologies that we're looking at and trying to make sure that we invest the taxpayers' money in a way that is going to be very efficient and also is going to be useful and used in conjunction with our communities in which our sailors live, we live. There's no such thing as a naval base. Just like Alice was talking about with the building, you might have the lights on, but if nobody can get to the ships, then you really can't get underway. So in summary, thank you again very much for having the Navy here. I look forward to answering any questions in the future.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker is Dr. Ian Kirchunas, he's the Deputy Director of PNNL's Atmospheric Sciences and Global Change Division, which includes about 80 scientists. But I want to cut to what I think Ian's role really is. He's the translator. He's the guy who takes the massive amounts of data and translates it into actionable items, things that Commander Marburger can do at a base, or that Larry can do, in a metropolitan area, because without that translation, we just have this amorphous concern and no real sense of what our priorities are. And so you really have the key bridging role here, not to put any pressure on you, but because I think it's easy to get lost in, well, this is all about data, and my eyes are going to roll back in my head. But unless we get this part right, the rest of it doesn't work. So, Ian, please inform us.
Thank you, Craig. That wasn't an intimidating introduction at all. Hello, everybody. Try that again. Hello, everybody. Hello. That's right. We're hoping this is a conversation, so we'll get that started now. So I'm going to start by showing some of the many reports that have been released over the years that assess different aspects of climate and other related global changes. And Alice showed some of these same covers in her remarks, and I think it really stands as a sort of a testament to the wide range of research that really has informed where we stand now with understanding the causes and the consequences of climate change, and increasingly what can be done to address the impacts of climate change. So I've shown a number of reports here, both international reports, regional reports. I think all these are excellent summaries. Depending on the region that you live in, the sector that you care most about, there's a lot of information out there. And I'm just going to try to grab a snippet of that to share with you today to sort of set the context for this conversation. The next few slides are largely going to draw on the report on the far left, which Alice also mentioned, the recently released National Climate Assessment, which really is the most comprehensive assessment to date of the impacts of climate change and what it means for the United States. But the conclusions in this report are certainly quite consistent with a whole host of other reports that have been recently released by a wide variety of domestic, international, regional groups. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those sort of key findings to get the ball rolling. So this is a phrase you've already heard today a couple of times. Climate change is not necessarily, it is an important issue for the future, but it's here now. And it's here now in different regions of the United States. We cannot attribute any particular one single event to climate change. But certainly, as Alice described, we can attribute many of the basic trends that we're observing to climate change, and we can say that certain types of events are consistent with an increase in other types of, increases in certain types of events is consistent with what you expect under a climate change, global warming scenario. So I just wanted to highlight that sort of key result from the NCA report, which I think was sort of a pivot point in terms of communicating our understanding of climate change. I think this figure has appeared in all three talks you've seen so far. So it's really illustrative that climate change is not necessarily just a faraway thing that affects faraway people, but it affects things that people here in the United States care about. And in fact, that includes national security. So John gave some excellent examples of that I would only just reiterate here, that things like declining Arctic sea ice, changes in coastal vulnerability, which are very regionally explicit phenomena. So we tend to think of global warming and sea level rise as being these long-term trends that affect different places more or less the same way, and that's not the case. There's a lot of regional variability, and it's very important to understand what those regional variability and changes are to really understand how those impacts are going to play out. For example, for sea level rise, the entire world is not going up at the same rate. There's coastal subsidence, where regions of the land surface are actually declining, which increases the relative rate of sea level rise in those regions. The changes in the circulation patterns in the ocean that we're observing give rise to different regional manifestations for the amount of sea level rise. Different parts of North America will experience different parts of sea level rise depending on those regional patterns. And in addition, the melting ice in Greenland and in the Arctic and in glaciers worldwide have fingerprints in terms of how they affect global sea level, because they actually affect the gravitational field of the Earth. And this can give rise to regional manifestations, different regional manifestations of sea level rise. And we need to understand all that just to give accurate sort of projections of what sea level rise might look like in different places. Climate change also has these indirect impacts that become harder and harder to tease out the full causal chain of events. Clearly there's going to be impacts on food security, but exactly how those are going to play out, where those are going to play out, how frequently we're going to see different types of food insecurity issues arise is really a healthy and active research area that we're currently really trying to address through a wide range of institutions. Other examples of climate change impacts that matter for national security are things like extreme heat, which can affect training, it can affect force readiness, it can affect infrastructure, and a whole host of other issues that are really relevant to national security missions. I got more bad news. The impacts of climate change are really projected to increase. And actually, if you look at this figure on the left, I think no science of climate change talk is complete without graphs of things going up and to the right. And in this particular chart just shows two different scenarios of where we might be headed in terms of global temperature change under a couple of different assumptions about the rate at which future greenhouse emissions will rise. So the observations and the model reconstruction of historical temperature is on the left-hand side, and then you see these two lines over on the right-hand side. And I want to call your attention to two features on this graph. The first is, over the next several decades, a lot of climate change is already baked in. What matters is the emissions that we've released up until the present day. And we actually have not experienced the full range of warming due to the greenhouse gases that have been emitted to the atmosphere to date, because it takes a long time for things like the oceans to warm up and for circulation patterns to fully evolve to a state that they would be. And second point to make is there is actually a pretty wide divergence in terms of projecting where global temperatures are going to be at the end of the century. And there's two important sort of key factors affecting this. One is that our ability to project exactly how much climate change is going to occur given a certain scenario of greenhouse gas emissions is variable. There's different models that project slightly different results, and that's actually the shading that you see around each of those curves is an indication of what we think that sort of uncertainty with the sensitivity of the climate system might be to greenhouse gas emissions. But perhaps an even bigger thing that we don't know is what human societies are going to do over the next several decades in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If we go on sort of a more business as usual type of scenario where greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase in the atmosphere, you could very well see a scenario play out like the A2 scenario here, which is a more rapid increase in global temperatures that continues beyond 2100. The other scenario shown here is more of a scenario that implies some degree of emissions reduction, where there are global actions and national actions to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations and really bring the curve down so that the ultimate degree of climate change is somewhat reduced or mitigated. And so there's some good news, is we actually still have an opportunity to make a difference in terms of what path we're on. And I think that the military, national security community writ large can play an important role in that endeavor, as well as just in reacting to the impacts of climate change. So there are things we can do, both to manage the unavoidable, i.e. Deal with the impacts that are already baked in and that are already going to happen, as well as to manage where ultimately that trajectory goes, and how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions to try to avoid some of the most potentially severe consequences of climate change, both domestically and internationally. And these are just some images from the National Climate Assessment Report that show some of the steps that are described in more detail that could make a contribution to that endeavor. So the other kind of main point that I wanted to make with my remarks is trying to describe how the scientific community writ large can help not just inform where is climate change going and answering that question, but understanding what are the likely impacts of climate change in different places and for different sectors. How are they going to affect individual people, individual communities, et cetera. The graph there in the middle on the right there is from Washington State, showing a pretty significant decline in snowpack in that region. Even though most model projections show not a big change in the overall amount of precipitation for the Pacific Northwest, there are big seasonal changes, and in particular the amount of precipitation falling in the winter in the form of snow is going to decline. More of it's going to fall in the form of rain. And this has big implications in terms of hydropower production, in terms of flood control, and in terms of dealing with salmon migration and other ecological issues in the Northwest. It also has implications for wildfire. I was actually up in the part of Washington State with my family camping 2 weekends ago, and we had to evacuate due to the forest fires. So that was an extreme environmental event that I experienced firsthand that I would not recommend to anybody. So understanding what those impacts might be, where they might be, and how they might play out through this interconnected set of variables is a really important endeavor of the science community. But we can also do a lot to inform responses to climate change. What can be done to increase the resilience of our energy systems, our water systems, our food systems, our national security apparatus writ large? What can we do to increase the security of our energy supply and other forms of, say, food security and other forms of things that make life comfortable and that make us prosperous as a nation? And also the sustainability of our energy systems, our food systems, and our other systems to understand what are the net impacts that these systems are having on the environment, and what can we do to mitigate those footprints, yet still maintain the standard of living that we all have come to appreciate. So, got more bad news, unfortunately. It isn't always easy. So the scientific community, I think, could do a better job in a number of ways in terms of informing these responses and helping decision makers, like those seated at the table up here, understand what can really be done to effectively deal with the consequences of climate change and to help deal with creating solutions. And so the first point to make here is information about current and projected future climate change is necessary but not sufficient. The loading dock approach of, here's my climate data, would you like some? Isn't always that helpful in terms of really informing what matters to different decision makers. A more effective model is one that really incorporates science and decision making more holistically, and this figure is from a report I worked on in my previous life at the National Academies with a series of reports called America's Climate Choices. And this figure shows the sort of iterative scheme, sort of a risk management-based adaptive practice for incorporating climate information, identifying vulnerabilities and risks to systems at hand, and identifying opportunities and co-benefits in terms of different responses that can be incorporated to deal effectively not just with climate change, but with all these sort of environmental trends that we're facing. The other thing that makes this a hard problem is that many of the risks to security are in fact multifaceted and involve multiple stresses. So you really have to understand how different systems interact with one another. This is one example about health outcomes, noting that they are affected by a huge range of factors, and climate is just one of those. So it is important to not just provide climate information in a vacuum. Global temperatures going up 3 degrees, sea level rise is going up by this amount or could be this amount, but to help decision makers understand how that fits into the context of the other factors that they need to account for in their decision making enterprises. And I know that I'm hoping that Larry will touch on that in his remarks as well. So a couple final slides on things that we're doing at P&L and that other scientists and practitioner communities are doing to help try to improve our ability to deliver that sort of actionable information to decision makers across a wide range of sectors. So first is developing data tools, modeling systems, and other ways to inform different aspects of climate change relevant to national security as well as to a host of other issues. I've listed a couple of the efforts that are going on across P&L and in my division in particular up here. And one of the key features of a lot of these initiatives is we're really trying to understand the intersections amongst these different systems, not treating climate change in a vacuum, but really integrating the biophysical, climate, hydrology, ecological systems with an understanding of, we are a Department of Energy lab after all, energy systems. How does climate change affecting the sort of supply and demand of energy, transmission of energy under different scenarios, as well as socioeconomic systems and how those play out. There are many other labs, universities, and other groups that are doing this, and this function of working, bridging between the science community and the sort of decision-making and stakeholder communities is one that really could use a lot more attention, a lot more expertise, and it isn't just a benefit to climate change, but actually improving the tools that we use to make these projections really benefits by having this interaction with stakeholders to understand what are the variables that really matter to people. As one example of the kind of output you can get from a sort of a global scale model is marrying up projections of future water demand in different parts of the world based on trends in agricultural production, energy production, population trends, with the projected water supply from climate models. As you can get a map like this that just shows sort of regional hotspots, places where it's pretty clear that something's going to have to give in terms of water stress. And this can be an important kind of result for understanding the big picture. It's also important to have sort of higher resolution. Excuse me, the smoke from the wildfires, I guess, is still in my lungs. It's also important to have a higher resolution picture so people can really start to see, understand what changes might look like where they live. And doing this sort of work, and this is cutting edge research that we're doing at PNNL to really look at projections of water demand down to a very detailed level that really try to show what trends might look like. And this is just out a couple of decades. So this is one scenario looking out in the 2020 to 2039 timeframe under one scenario of future climate change using a particular climate model result. So the results might change, but these are sort of illustrative of the type of changes you might see in projected surface water deficit. And it helps you to understand where the hot spots might be, where it is that you might need to do more in-depth analysis, look at a broader range of scenarios to really understand what the vulnerabilities might be in those places and what can be done to adapt to those changes. I did mention we're a Department of Energy lab, so we've done quite a bit of work in terms of formulating systems that allow us to assess the sort of comprehensive impacts of climate change, extreme weather events, and other trends on both through heat waves and through changes in water availability on the supply of electricity, on demand for electricity. And it turns out that when you get things like an extreme heat wave combined with a drought, you're actually making two things work in the wrong direction. You can reduce the capacity of power plants and thus reduce the available supply of energy at the same electricity, at the same time that you're driving up air conditioning demand for residential and commercial buildings. So this is a rapid narrowing of supply and demand, and at some point the system doesn't work anymore. And so it's really important to understand what those trends might look like in the future, and we're working with regional stakeholders who are sort of involved in understanding what they need to do in terms of expanding their capacity, implementing efficiency programs and demand response programs and those sorts of issues in order to understand how to make sure that we continue to deliver affordable, safe, secure power systems, and to do so in a way where we're really looking across a range of different scenarios consistently in terms of how things play out. So if you're looking at an extreme climate change scenario, you're looking at what does the energy system look like under that kind of a scenario, so that you have an apples to apples kind of a comparison. Final example here is some work that we're doing at PNNL to help understand what the actual storm surge situation might be at U.S. Naval installations. And this is an extremely high resolution map. So this is, you can see where we are right here. Here's Annapolis area. And here is actually, if you've been to the U.S. Naval Academy, this is actually the sort of facility. And you can see the fine mesh of the grid here that allows us to really resolve all of the dynamical and physical processes that give rise to this, what would an actual hurricane-driven storm surge or other extreme storm event look like from a hydrological perspective at this site. And this can really help the decision makers there understand the vulnerability of their systems. So just some summary thoughts here in terms of re-articulating some of the points I've already made about climate change complicating existing threats to national security and raising new ones. We've heard the term a couple times already today about climate change being a force multiplier for the national security community. I think that additional work is needed to connect climate change research to a lot of different sectors, but national security in particular, to really understand what the key issues are and how we can better inform them. There's a lot of things that are happening that I think are relevant to this issue, but we really need to understand how to apply these capabilities and to do so in a thoughtful way that really understands what we know, what we still need to learn, and how we can best inform those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Our last speaker is Larry Phillips, the chair of the King County Council, which, as I said, is the government, the local government surrounding and including my home of Seattle. But before turning to him, I must confess that I initially didn't see a strong role for local government in the whole climate change, effort. It seemed to me that this was a national, international problem, had to be solved at that level, and that local governments weren't to play a huge role. But I was completely and utterly wrong for two reasons. One is, at least in the U.S., Congress has been unable to act, and so we don't have a national framework, and therefore it has to come from the state and local government as well as from the executive branch. But second, because there are certain things that can only be done at the local level. Land use planning, roads, ports, that is inherently local government and where literally the rubber meets the road. So you, Larry, have taken a leadership role in proving that to be true and to taking concrete steps to put local governments in a stronger position to deal with those issues. So thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you. I also want to mention that Larry also worked for Senator Jackson and serves on the foundation board. So, Larry.
Well, Craig, thank you for a very kind introduction. Yes, serving on the Henry M. Jackson Board is a privilege for me, and something in service to him and our country at that time was a great part of my own personal journey and story. But it has been mentioned that this topic is very much in his wheelhouse, and I think we know more about him and his legacy and this issue. It's very much the truth. It's a real privilege to be with you today, and also with so many of our panelists from the Seattle Endeavor on June 6th. We had a wonderful opportunity to begin this discussion on the intersection of national security issues and climate change. I think we came out with a report that really brings that intersection to the fore, and an issue that we will be endeavoring to understand and do better with as we move forward as a consequence of the symposium. It was very clear from the scientists who were in the room that day, and also all the science that has been gathered to date, that climate change is not only here, but the impacts are now. As we've seen from Ian's report, that is very much the case, and his work and the data and the information that he's gathered is helping us as decision makers to formulate plans about how best to prepare with and to mitigate and to adapt as much as possible as we move forward. We very much, I think, are in agreement that the definition of national security is expanding and changing as the impacts of climate change are becoming more profound. In addition to putting lives at risk, and that's very much the case, climate change also threatens our economic security, which, as Craig noted earlier, is the foundation of our national security and something that we have to pay attention to at the local level. For example, local governments have a huge role to play in protection of the movement of goods through our ports and over roads and bridges that frankly must work if our economy is to work, that connects us and makes sure that that is sustained over time. I have the privilege of chairing the King County Council. I've been on the council for some time. The King County Council is the council for this Seattle region, and we have felt the opportunity and also been very fortunate to be able to have a group of citizens who have helped us to advance these issues with regard to climate change and how it's affecting us locally and what we must do about it. So I'll be focusing my remarks today around impacts to the Puget Sound region and what we face in terms of climate change, how we are preparing for a new future, and in many ways experiencing the impacts of climate change as we move forward. I just wanted to note as we get started here on the outline for my remarks, That may look like Lake Snoqualmie. That is actually the Snoqualmie Valley. You can just barely make out the meandering Snoqualmie River. That is for most of our local restaurant industry and for many of our groceries, the breadbasket for vegetables, fresh vegetables on a regular basis. The Snoqualmie Valley is very close to where I live, about 30 minutes away from the very urban part of the state of Washington. That flood event is not rare. It is often, and it is increasing in terms of the number of times we see it and its severity, and it is an impact that we live with on a regular basis. I just raise it as something that we get to see at home and tells us by way of observation we must deal with. Moving on, these impacts are very real to us in the Northwest. The signs have been clear for some time. Just to give you a few examples, marine waters increased in acidity by 25% since the Industrial Revolution, making our waters even more acidic than the open ocean. One thing we're not talking about today, which I wish we would talk about more in the future, is ocean acidification. It is going to be it's going to have a profound impact on all of us over time. But we'll have to think that we'll take that up in a different symposium and perhaps follow on work to this. But the impacts to shellfish and plankton, that's the foundation of the food chain, and are real. We are seeing that play out in some of our food and marine products. And we, all of us, obtain a large amount of protein from the sea. So ocean acidification is something that we've got to pay attention to. Sea levels in Puget Sound rose 8 inches over the past century, and since 1950, our average snowpack, something that Ian talked about in the Cascade Mountains, has decreased by some 20%, with spring snowmelt occurring earlier, and the resulting low summertime water volumes are also part of what we see on a regular basis. And not surprisingly, temperatures in our streams exceed salmon safe temperatures. Salmon recovery is something I've been working on for 20 years, so this is not a good thing for our efforts in the Northwest to recover one of our regional icons. We are also seeing evidence that severe storms and flooding are occurring more frequently, as the class slide attested to, and certainly making our winters more wet and more difficult as we move forward. So, the science tells us that the impacts will continue, that they will increase, and they will be more significant. We can expect disruption to our marine ecosystems and widespread damage from flooding and storms, reduced water supply, and additional risk from wildfire. As it was alluded to earlier, as we speak, we are experiencing the largest wildfire in the history of the state of Washington. It has been burning now for some time and destroying entire communities. And that is somewhat strange from a region known to the rest of the world for its excessive rain. It is now burning out of control. Again, one of those observations that you just simply can't ignore as a local government official or someone dealing with your local citizens on a regular basis. So King County, if I move forward here, is developing responses to each one of these and making sure that we're doing our part to aggressively deal with climate change. We have been a leader in environmental programs for decades, but we have noticed and noted that we have a missing link with regard to how we dealt with climate change. We needed a strategic focus. So in February of 2012, we developed a call for a strategic climate action plan. That plan has been adopted and refined. It prioritizes actions, performance measurements, and accountability. I'll move to this next slide. And also identifying performance measures. That was the hardest part of what we endeavored to do. And we expect to update that in 2015. So there are, in terms of the goals of the plan, we have 5 in number. Transportation, land use, something we deal with on a regular basis in local government. Energy, of course. Forestry and agriculture, the consumption and materials management, and of course, preparing for climate change. And that has been, I think, the hallmark of our work, something that I hope other local governments around the country will be able to utilize. We are not, there's no pride in authorship here. We hope that that plan will be something that others will pick up and run with. Addressing climate change isn't just about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We have a plan for adaptation, and also for changing the environment, or for the environment is changing around us. Our focus on both county services and county government operations means that we are planning for the protection and the durability of our assets, as well as working with local governments and cities as our partners to prepare for the effects of climate change on the environment, human health, and the economy. We did hear at our symposium about the research at the University of Washington in terms of their climate impact group, what they are doing to help us. Data that they have developed is being used by decision makers to ensure that actions that we are taking now will be resilient against today's and tomorrow's threats. We have found examples, you will find examples in the report that has been issued and has been available to you today. So mitigating the effects of these flood risks, I want to take just a moment to mention this particular slide. About 20 years ago, I founded the Cedar River Council, and it was developed to deal with the health of the people living on the Cedar, and as well as the health of the Cedar itself. Floods, as we've noticed, have been more prevalent, and we had a number of housing units in and along the river, not the least of which are some mobile home parks. This particular slide illustrates, I think, the difficulty of increased flooding events, what it means to people and the place they call home. We were able to actually, the council and the county were able to buy out that particular mobile home. Those homes were on septic. The water table was very high. It created a tremendous public health problem. We relocated every one of the residents to housing that was equal to or better than that, and returned the river to its natural flow. So if there's a win-win-win in our efforts, this is probably as good an example that you're going to get, at least on our efforts to date. And it was a consequence of our adoption of the King County Flood Control District in 2007. We have used that plan to manage our rivers for long-term flood reduction and also reducing the risks to the public and the economy, and to accommodate and protect our rivers much more in their natural functions. It has had great success. Again, I would hope that other local governments around the country would be able to adopt it and to use it. So we are also moving beyond just what's happening in our rivers to prepare our local facilities. King County is preparing for climate change by ensuring that those county facilities and infrastructure can withstand the impacts of climate change, so that we continue to make essential services available to our public without interruption. One very important set of facilities that we are constantly working with, of course, is our roads. In 2014, we updated our strategic plan for road services, identifying climate change as a potential change driver for the county's management of its extensive road system. Unfortunately, and this is true for I think most governments around the country, we don't have a viable source of fund to address this critical need. So while we're planning, we're doing everything we can to find the funds necessary to make this adaptation. And another area of investment, which is very important to our community, and that is the work of our county's wastewater treatment division, WTD. It treats wastewater for some 1.5 million people, an average of 180 million gallons per day, billions of gallons of wastewater on an annual basis. It is also threatened by climate change, and so we were making a number of adaptations to prepare for those changes, analyzing the vulnerability of existing facilities, and also constructing facilities to address our combined sewer overflows, which occur on a regular basis because of our wet weather, and particularly during the extreme weather of the winter. And we are also investing in reclaimed water, especially in the northern portion of the county. So these severe weather emergencies are also threats to our immediate communities. We need to make sure that they stay safe during volatile weather events and these patterns that continue to cause weather emergencies for our citizens. In March, As many of you may note and recall, we had the Oso landslide in the northern part of the state of Washington, following a two-fold increase in our normal rainfall. And it covered a square mile, killed 43 people, making it the deadliest landslide in the history of the United States. So, unfortunately, while we need to prepare for these increased events, funding has also decreased in this area over the last 5 years. Federal and state funding that the county received for emergency management planning has decreased by some 75%. Making us all less secure in the face of these rising risks. So unfortunately, we still don't have the funds we need to manage for this particular eventuality, something that is becoming more prevalent. And we are still looking for the funds to make sure that we are better in the future. Wildfire, we've talked about that somewhat today. Higher summer temperatures, more volatile weather patterns, and drier forests increase risk to wildland and to wildlife. As I noted earlier this summer, we've had these tremendous wildfire events. They are not just an annual situation, or just a singular event. They come to us on an annual basis. The wildfire that we referenced just a few minutes ago cost $50 million. We know that that cost will be increasing. So the issue highlights the importance of another action that we have taken in the past, which is to have a very definite urban growth boundary in King County, preventing sprawling residential communities into our forested lands and reducing attendant fire risks by our actions. As we think beyond the physical impacts of climate change to our region, we also need to factor in how climate change in other parts of the country could affect the Puget Sound region. And particularly, we need to start to think about how climate can drive populations in ways in which we hadn't thought of previously. We are aware of the destabilizing effects of changing climate internationally in regions of the world that have been feeling the effects of climate change more dramatically. But climate refugees are becoming a fact of life. And we expect climate to impact our region in the Northwest. We also know that other parts of the nation and the country are experiencing these extreme droughts as well. But unlike many other regions, as we are preparing for climate-induced changes we know that are coming, we also know that we will be an obvious choice for business and populations needing to relocate. People moving because of climate change will also moving because of jobs. Our region has consistently outperformed the national economy. It is home to modern corporate engines like Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks, Nordstrom, and the Boeing Company, and international giants like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So adding to the enviable scenery and also our wonderful recreational opportunities that we have here, it makes Puget Sound an attractive destination for those who may be fleeing risks and insecurity as a consequence of climate change. So in King County, we must address this. If we underestimate our future population and in terms of our region, and particularly with regard to migration, we won't be able to plan effectively for infrastructure to accommodate that growth. Forward here. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, local governments are integrally connected to the national security impacts of climate change. We are the first responders to emergencies and disasters. The cumulative effect of these local events could have a significant implication for national security in the sense that they strain the capacity of local, state, and federal governments to effectively respond. Water shortages, increasing food shortages and prices, and aging infrastructure, in particular energy infrastructure, economic losses, and potential migration are all climate impacts that can further threaten our national security. And at the same time, the country is facing the domestic impact, at the same time that we are facing this domestic impact from climate change, the catastrophic weather events around the world will create more demand for American troops, as is mentioned, not only for humanitarian purposes, but also for international events as well. So as an elected official, I think about what resources will be available to local governments to respond to these challenges that we're facing in a time when we have diminished financial resources. Our governments in King County have been striving to do everything possible to minimize the impacts of climate change and to prepare for what we can't prevent. But it is clear that we need action at the national scale. Local governments may be the first responders, but we cannot stand alone, nor can we stand apart from each other in this endeavor. We need to work closely together at all levels of government to prepare for the impacts that we know are here and will continue to come from climate change. This must not remain a political issue. It must be a policy issue, one that we all address, and one that will have increasing importance as we move forward. So we need now to act as a nation on this increasing threat to our national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. So we've been talking a long time, and I assume you've used this to good effect, but to load up on lots of great questions. So who would like to go first? Back in the back of the room there.
Is there a question?
Do we have a microphone? Great.
Hi.
Please identify yourself and...
I don't know if this is on. Okay. Julia Piper with Climate Wire, part of Environment Energy Publishing. Thank you for the panel. That was interesting. And I wanted to ask, I guess, about, all the panelists, I think, touched on adaptation, how that's needed, but also mitigation as part of a larger strategy here. Sort of two questions around that. Does the DoD have a role to play in mitigation? Adaptation's obviously in your purview, but where does the mitigation element come in? And what would you say to anyone on the panel to folks that have a harder time justifying the costs, I guess, for mitigation measures, things like clean energy, carbon restriction, CCS, things like that? Obviously, that's being debated on Capitol Hill. So how do we justify the short-term costs for those measures that are part of, obviously, this larger strategy we've been talking about at a time of economic hardships still in many places of the country? Thanks.
Who would like to address that? Alice?
Sure. First question on mitigation, the role DoD can play. They're already playing a significant role. They have taken aggressive measures to increase their sustainability, to look at their energy use across their facilities. And I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but they have already reduced their energy consumption and are continuing on an approach to do so. So to the extent they're a substantial consumer, they are doing their part to reduce their consumption. We had a Champions of Change event at the White House honoring vets who have been working on sustainability issues and also recognizing that in our theaters of war, energy, we have to get energy to the troops, but that puts our troops at risk because the more energy that's needed out there, the more folks are at risk in providing that energy. As to the cost for mitigation, timing is everything. Today, the White House issued the cost of delaying action to stem climate change. This is a report dealing directly with the issue about upfront costs now, particularly with mitigation to reduce costs long term. I haven't fully digested the findings, but Jason Furman has stated, and he is the chairman of our National Council of Economic Advisors that published the document. He has stated each decade we delay acting results in an added cost of dealing with the problem of an extra 40%. So definitely there are economic downsides to the country by putting off postponing and taking a wait-and-see attitude. I think one thing that has been mentioned, Ira did a good job of describing the science, translating the science for us, is that the emissions that we're doing now, if we don't cut our emissions, we are just having a greater and greater problem down the road. And we need to aggressively cut our emissions now to ensure that our children really enjoy a planet similar to the one that we've enjoyed.
Thank you, Alice. Yes.
Good afternoon, Deanne Divis with Inside GNSS Magazine. I'd like to have the panelists address an aspect of infrastructure you didn't have a chance to touch on, and that's the navigation aids and the waterways. Particularly to the gentleman from the Navy, if you could speak to whatever you're doing in terms of mapping as the Arctic waters open up, what your task list looks like, what you're doing, and then to the folks locally, are you looking at changes in the waterways as the rivers flood, on the littoral waters along the coast? What is it that we're looking at in a real way as we try to move around our country, and particularly move around the Arctic?
Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. So if you take a really long read of the Arctic Roadmap, you'll see that there's a section in there on Arctic hydrography and charting. It's pretty obvious to us whenever we were writing the roadmap and we were looking at what we were missing in the Arctic, that charts were among some of the deficiencies that we have up there. So like all things in the Arctic, and I kind of mentioned this in my speech, we're taking a collaborative effort. So there are other countries, a lot of the other Arctic countries that are up there that have good charts. We're trying to get that information from them and working in a collaborative way. And of course also working within the waters of the United States through the traditional routes of essentially NOAA, NGA, and working with the United States Coast Guard.
Larry?
So we are, one of our hallmarks of our plan is its adaptation. One of the things we're asking is that exact sort of question. We have a tremendous amount of commerce that flows through Puget Sound, through our port facilities, and also in my own district through the Ballard locks. Some 50% of the nation's catch actually goes through those locks, all threatened by potential effects of climate change. So in terms of what's happening with navigation and also what we're doing in terms of supporting our infrastructure changes, those have to go hand in hand relative to protecting commerce and facilities and lives as well. That's part of our plan in terms of not just today, but in the future, how they work together to be smarter and to be more effective and to use the dollars that we do have and hopefully will have in the future to affect change.
Thank you, Larry. Other questions? Gentleman right there.
Hugh Haskell from the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. We haven't said too much today about politics and the influence of politics on climate change mitigation and adaptation, but there are a significant number of elected officials, both local and national, who either don't understand climate change or outright reject its existence. And many of them are being influenced by organizations that have an interest in preventing action on climate change. And some of them are in positions where they can make some significant impacts on that. What can we do to change their minds? It seems like what we do has to be done on a face-to-face basis. We've tried just putting out the evidence and letting them look at it, and it hasn't worked. Is there something more that we can do to bring some of the people? Senator Inhofe is maybe the most well-known, but he's certainly not the only one. Can we bring these people around? Because they're going to make a big problem for us if they don't.
Great question. I'd say Alice at the national level and Larry at the local level, perhaps?
I think it's been mentioned. It is very unfortunate that this has become a political issue as to what is occurring with climate change. With that said, your question is, what can we do? And I think the most important thing that each of us can do is be a messenger on this issue in a very real way. explaining to your friends, your colleagues, if you have any publications, tweets, whatever you do, that this is an urgent, real problem that's happening now, that we have real choices in front of us. We need to take action. We need to stop our emissions, reduce the emissions of harmful pollutants, and on the flip side, to manage the unavoidable. We need to make sound decisions as we invest in our communities as to what those communities will look like and how they can withstand the impacts. But I really think it's up to each of us who have listened to the evidence. I'm a former judge, and I am not a scientist, but I did hear scientific evidence frequently in the courtroom, and I came to this without a deep knowledge of what was occurring, and I have personally listened to the evidence, read the evidence, studied it, and I am confident that we are facing a substantial risk to the nation as reflected in all the documents that I mentioned to you. And that if you are a person who engages, as Larry does, in risk management, given the weight of the evidence that's before us, we need to get going now on reducing and managing this risk. So how do we do that? We start talking to everyone in our community and saying we need to act now. And as Larry has been such a leader in this, it's acting at your local community. You can make a difference.
Larry.
Thank you, Greg. That's a great question, and I think probably the most telling question of our time on this issue. I think the most important thing that came out of the symposium in Seattle at the end of the day, the collective decision by all 36 people who participated and spoke up, was it was incumbent upon us. We had a duty to lead. To take the information, the knowledge that we had, and to convey that in the most effective way possible in terms of communication to change minds. In a way, that's the business I'm in, is to be able to look at these issues and to communicate with the public on issues that are perhaps over the horizon to them, but are issues that we must deal with today. Yes, there are, I had the fortune or misfortune yesterday of flying here from Seattle, sitting next to a climate denier. And as much as I tried to avoid that conversation for 2/3 of the trip, I couldn't avoid it entirely. There are individuals that will deny this no matter how much scientific information is out there. But this is a great reason to call America home, is you have the capacity to change minds, to change yourself, to change your views on things, and to communicate that effectively. So I think not everyone shares this. I actually think this is an existential threat. I've said many times to the people I represent, if you love your kids and your grandkids, you'll do something about this issue. If that's the case, you'll meet that duty head on. You will lead on this issue. You will try and change minds. You will bring the information that Ian and others have brought to us. And as decision makers, you'll do your best to put that into a plan and put that plan into effect. That's what we're doing at King County, and I would hope, as I said in my remarks, that the work that we've done to date, and I think there's more work to be done locally, can be replicated across the country, and through that effort, change minds. I'm an old Boy Scout, and you go through all the Boy Scout experiences. The best thing that ever occurred to me coming out of Boy Scouts was the power of observation, to step back and look at the world around you. And if you look at these examples, internationally, nationally, locally, you have an opportunity to talk to your local citizens, your fellow citizens, about this is not the world we're used to seeing. It has real impacts on our lives. It's real threats. And as Americans, we have a duty to step up and deal with it. So with that, I think we can change minds.
Craig, could I add one thing?
You bet.
So, Larry, I can't tell you how many times I've had that conversation on the airplane, like dozens.
We should sit next to each other.
Yeah. And one point I always try to make is, I wish the conversation that the local communities were having, we as a nation, internationally, we were having is what to do about it. I think there's a room for healthy debate about the best policies, actions, strategies for dealing with the impacts of climate change and what to do to mitigate climate change. One point that was made at our symposium is that, and the kind of overarching topic here today is the potential role the national security community can play in sort of informing and motivating that conversation. And Sherry Goodman was at that session in Seattle and shared a couple of reports that the CNA Corporation has put out, one in 2007, one in 2014, where a whole host of admirals and generals sort of signed on to this idea that climate change is a threat multiplier, that it does pose risks to national security. When people understand that it does pose risks, that's a framing, and there's many, I think, communicators in the audience today who understand that framing issues is all, communication is all about framing issues. Framing this as a national security challenge could move us in the direction of having that conversation.
Very good. Sir.
I'm Mike McCracken from the Climate Institute. So I've been working on this as a scientist for 45 years, and I guess I'm very encouraged by all that has been done. I'm impressed by what is said. I'm glad it's coming to the fore. I particularly appreciated what Ms. Hill was commenting about the administration thing, but I guess I just have to ask the question, how can the administration justify continuing to lease coal when it's doing it in the Powder River Basin? And if you go read the environmental impact statement for that, it is not even close to accepting the science that is being explained here. It's way out of date. It's just not justified to do that, and yet it keeps being leased, proposing 20-year leases that would go out at very, very low cost. It's just truly astounding that that's happening and that they're defending cases for doing this.
I appreciate the question. I think from the President's Climate Action Plan, you can see that mitigation of harmful carbon pollution is one of the pillars, the 3 pillars of that, one that he's been working very hard on with the proposed power plant rule. And he is following an all-of-the-above strategy, looking at all aspects. But I think that it's also been recognized that we are still going to be relying on fossil fuels until we get to a state where we have sufficient alternative methods of energy or delivery and energy available. So my comment is that we still have fossil fuel very much fueling our economy and fueling us, but we are looking ahead, and that is part of the President's Climate Action Plan now to reduce our emissions.
The back there, gentleman in the middle, you with the glasses. Yes, thank you.
John Scott Jones with the Population Institute. The projecting out through 2050, in the Sahel, we can expect nearly all of those countries to double, triple, Niger will quadruple in population. At the same time as John Marburg, you were saying it's water, people, and behavior. There's going to be less water. There's going to be far more people. And I'm wondering whether the administration or the Navy has any consideration to that huge population growth that's going to be happening in a lot of these areas that are also going to be challenged by climate change.
Yeah, regarding the population growth, I mean, I don't think the Navy is looking specifically. I'd have to talk to my intelligence brethren about what they're looking at in that regard. But I think the message is clear. No matter what growth we have, we know there's going to be growth. You just mentioned it. Maybe it's 200%. Maybe it's 400%. We know that water is going to be an issue. Maybe it's going to be too much, but maybe it's going to be too little. What we need to do is we need to figure out, one, how we're going to do things here, because we have our own adaptation issues domestically. We have the ways and the means in order to do that. And I think that the way that the Navy is looking at working with our traditional partner in the State Department and with allied navies is to figure out how we're going to do it here methodologically and make sure that the pathways are open and free in order to share those adaptive methodologies so that whenever it does come along at 50 years from now and there's a 200% growth in population in Indonesia, that the effects of that don't reflect the increase in percentage.
One more question. Yes, right there, please.
Hi, Megan Bresnahan with the Association of Climate Change Officers. So, Councilmember Phillips, you addressed this briefly, but one of the things that we've repeatedly come across is a challenge in finding sustained funding for adaptation, and I was wondering if anyone's come across any strategies for how to find that funding.
Larry. It's a continual effort, seemingly daily effort on our part to figure out ways to fund not just matters that are attended to the issues we're talking about today, but an awful lot of just basic local government functions that we are charged with providing, often by state mandate, to our citizens. The way in which we've dealt with it is to lay out specifically the risks to our public of if we don't pay for this, what will happen. And we've had a pretty good conversation with our local residents in Seattle and King County about the need to step up, and I mentioned the flood district that we formed and funded. While we were authorized under state law to do that, we had to take the actions locally to actually provide the funding. It has been a godsend for many of the issues that I touched on briefly here in terms of adapting to climate change. We have an extensive river system in Western Washington. We have 5 major rivers systems in King County alone. So that flood district and the funding that we've been able to bring to bear has gone a long ways towards helping us, at least with adaptation. Some of the other issues like roads I mentioned, that's an ongoing debate. We are still trying to figure out how to either move the state legislature, which has now been a failing effort over 5 years and 10 sessions of the legislature to get us moving on roads. But we continue to work at it to impress upon them the need to sustain our roads and to adapt given what's happening with weather. So we just don't give up. We are united in that attempt to keep finding funding. And I can't speak for other governments, even the state of Washington at the local level, but you have to be persistent, and I think the best way to get there is to show folks what happens if you don't have the funds. We've been able to do that fairly dramatically. I only showed you a few slides today, but being able to talk to the public directly about what the costs are to their lives locally goes a long ways to help them change minds on funding.
I would just like to add one thing. The president did announce just a few weeks ago a substantial amount of money that will be available. It's through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. It'll make $1 billion available to communities that have been struck by natural disasters in recent years. This competition is designed to promote risk assessment and planning, and then it will fund implementation of innovative resilience projects. The eligibility is dependent on whether a state or county has experienced a presidentially declared major disaster in 2011, 2012, or 2013. 48 out of 50 states have experienced that, plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, plus 17 local municipal governments. I think that competition is a great opportunity for communities like Larry's and others that have been leaders in this and been thinking about it. They can jump ahead. And those communities that simply want to start with their innovative resilience planning.
Could I just add one thing to that? And Alice, you triggered something I mentioned, is that to the extent that you win that battle on finding some local sources of funds to step up on infrastructure or whatever it might be, our experience has been, but we work really hard at this as well. The federal government's been a great partner when we arrive with a match. So if you have local funds that you've put up and you're addressing Congress or coming to the administration saying this is what we're doing, I know federal budgets are tighter than ever, but nevertheless they've been a great partner. And I mention that because oftentimes these projects get done with not just one source of funds, but you cobble them together over time, and you're able to address them by using various sources of funds. So we've been pretty proactive about that over a long period of time, so it's been very helpful. Your comments triggered the importance of the federal partner. Thank you.
On that very encouraging note, let us conclude. Before I turn it back over to Roger Mark, I want to thank each of the panelists who did a fabulous job having been at the 8-hour session in Seattle and heard you today, it's the best of those 8 hours. And you can see that we've all been thinking about this since then. And it's a discussion that I, on behalf of the Jackson Foundation, I can say we were going to want to continue. And by the way, in doing so, PNNL has been a fabulous partner. The Wilson Center, we appreciate everything you've done to help advance what we've done today, and hopefully we look forward to working with you in the future, because I can assure you that the Jackson Foundation is going to be doing more in this field. Please join me in thanking a great panel.
Thank you very much, Craig. We have a treat planned for you, but I just wanted to end before we move on to the reception to say that, I think Henry Jackson and Woodrow Wilson are smiling down on us this afternoon. We've had a really, really good discussion, and I want to recap the discussion in terms of four areas that I think have really come out. And the first for me is the sense of urgency. We've heard this from the panelists. Nobody gets mean sea level. Arctic is a ground central for climate change. Impacts of climate change are here now, and the rate of impacts are accelerating. And you can't have a climate change talk and be accurate without those graphs with things going up on the right. So we heard a little bit about the urgency of these issues. The second theme for me that came out in our discussion this afternoon was the question about framing and a redefinition of how we look at these issues. We heard a little bit about varsity level responses, moving from humanitarian responses to looking at impacts like conflict. It's about water, sort of understanding that dimension of looking at these connections. What does conflict mean in terms of climate change? It's not just about counting missiles or terrorist cells. We have to rethink how we look at these issues, and we have to mitigate and adapt. We talked about these connections being multifaceted and being the result of multiple stresses. We saw a consistent theme about how it's tied to economic security. We talked about the economic impact of wildfires, for example. And then the question about domestic climate refugees and population shifts came up a couple of times also. So this whole question of how do we redefine and frame these issues was a second important theme for me. The third theme that I think was really quite important was the question of scale. We talked about the international connections, the domestic connections, and connections at the local level. We looked at implications overseas and what this meant for us here at home, what it means in terms of how we deploy our troops. But we also talked about the lessons that the Navy is learning from its international work and how that can be applied here and shared elsewhere. We talked about looking at global scale models. We looked at water stress, for example, and regional hotspots and the importance of high-resolution models to see local manifestations of these issues. We talked about what can be achieved at the local level and only at the local level. We saw models from King County. We saw a good example of a flood control district, and we're reminded that local government often serves as a first responder. So very, very good framing and looking at questions around scale and what does this mean. And then finally, for me, moving to questions around action. What can we do in concrete terms? The panelists talked about how to act before the unavoidable becomes overwhelming. There was a question about how do we avoid the unmanageable and how do we manage the unavoidable. So some very good thinking for us in terms of action. How do we convey uncertainty in a way that it does not lead to inaction? How do we acknowledge that all sorts of things are happening with climate change? The Arctic is a chance to get it right for the first time around. We talked about science and decision-making, risks and opportunities and co-benefits, and how it links to a variety of sectors, and what does that mean for the scope of decision-making. We looked at how actions for resilience, actions today can be resilient against what will happen tomorrow. We talked about funding and the challenges of funding, and when funding is decreased at the local level, how does that make us less secure? But what can we do, and how can we manage in those scenarios? And then finally, I really appreciated the statement about we cannot stand alone and we cannot stand apart. This cannot remain just a political issue, it's a policy issue. So once again, with that summary, I think Henry Jackson and Woodrow Wilson are smiling down at us. We had a really good discussion this afternoon, and you have a wonderful opportunity now to continue this dialogue. We have a reception where we can continue to discuss these issues. So as we move towards the reception, know that we will have a summary of this discussion. It has been recorded, so we'll have a video archive of this discussion today. We will write a summary of the discussion that will be available on our website, newsecuritybeat.org. So you can go there to get a sense of how we've, to capture a little bit of the discussion that we have had today. So again, please join me in thanking the foundation and thanking Alice, Ian, Greg, John, and Larry. So I'll invite you, as you step out, just go straight across, and my colleagues will guide you. The reception is 1 minute away.